The town of Harrowridge had not changed much in 15 years, at least on the surface. The same narrow, winding roads snaked through the valley, lined with gnarled, leafless trees that seemed to watch in silence as Ava Sinclair drove past. The houses, small and weathered with age, leaned inward, their roofs sagging as though burdened by the weight of memories too heavy to bear. A cold mist clung to the ground, wrapping the town in an eerie stillness. Ava's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as her car slowed to a crawl. The towering silhouette of her childhood home loomed ahead, its broken windows and crumbling facade a reminder of the life she had left behind. She hadn't stepped foot in Harrowridge since the day her mother disappeared. The thought made her chest tighten, and she swallowed hard, pushing the memories back into the dark corners of her mind where they belonged. It was supposed to be a short trip, long enough to settle her father's affairs after his sudden death, long enough to pack up the remnants of her past, and then disappear for good. But as she stared at the old Victorian mansion that had stood vacant for years, a deep sense of foreboding settled in her gut. This place, this house, felt wrong. It always had. The front gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. The yard, overgrown and tangled with weeds, had swallowed most of the pathway leading to the front door. The house stood like a giant among the trees, its windows like dark eyes staring back at her, waiting. She hesitated on the porch, her breath catching in her throat as she slid the old brass key into the lock. The door opened with a groan, and a cold draft brushed against her skin. Inside, the house was just as she remembered, grand but decayed. Dust clung to the velvet drapes and furniture, and cobwebs draped like gossamer in the corners. But there was something else, a heaviness in the air. It was as if the house was holding its breath. Ava stepped inside, her footsteps muffled on the old wood floors. The house swallowed her presence, the door closing behind her with a soft click. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but the silence unnerved her. She moved quickly through the rooms, flipping on light switches as she went. Most of the bulbs had long since burned out, leaving much of the mansion cloaked in shadow. The kitchen was just as she remembered it, and her gaze lingered on the scarred wooden table where she and her mother used to sit, sharing whispered conversations late at night. Her mother had always seemed preoccupied, always staring at the mirrors in the house like she saw something Ava couldn't. Ava shook her head, brushing the thought away. She didn't want to think about her mother right now, but it was impossible not to, not here. That night, after unpacking a few things, Ava wandered through the house in search of something she couldn't quite name. It was the sound that stopped her, quiet, almost imperceptible at first, like a distant murmur. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The house creaked and settled, but underneath it, there was something else. Whispers, faint, as though coming from just beyond the walls, or beneath them. She followed the sound down the long, winding hallway that led to the back of the house. The air grew colder the further she walked, and a damp, earthy smell filled her nose. The whispers grew louder, clearer now. It was a woman's voice, muffled, but unmistakable, and it was coming from the attic. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood at the base of the narrow staircase leading up to the attic door. A part of her didn't want to go any further, but something pulled at her, compelled her forward. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The attic was as she remembered, dark, cluttered, and smelling of mildew. Dust particles hung in the air, illuminated by the single shaft of moonlight that slipped through a crack in the roof. Old furniture was stacked haphazardly against the walls, along with boxes that hadn't been touched in years. But in the far corner, something new caught her eye. A small weathered box sat on the floor, half hidden beneath a tattered sheet. Ava's breath hitched as she knelt down and opened it. Inside, nestled among old letters and faded photographs, was a journal. Her mother's handwriting. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Ava flipped through it, her hands trembling. Most of the entries were mundane, written in her mother's familiar script until the last few pages. The handwriting became jagged, frantic, as though written in a hurry. The words were disjointed, cryptic. The mirror. Something is watching. I can feel it. It's always there, just out of sight. I made a mistake. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. So wrong. The veil is thinner than I thought. It wants... The entry cut off abruptly. Ava's skin prickled with unease. The whispering had stopped. The silence was louder than ever, pressing in on her from all sides. She closed the journal and stood, a shiver running down her spine. Something was wrong with this house. It wasn't just her memories haunting her. Something darker had lingered here, waiting, watching, and it had been waiting for her to come back. That night, Ava struggled to sleep. The old bed creaked beneath her as she tossed and turned, her mind spinning with fragments of her mother's journal and the unsettling feeling that the house was alive, breathing around her. Every creak and groan of the old mansion set her nerves on edge. Then, at some point in the darkest hours of the night, she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside her bedroom door. Ava froze, her body stiff beneath the covers. She strained to listen, her pulse thudding in her ears. The footsteps continued, a steady, measured pace moving down the hall. She sat up, her throat dry, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Someone was in the house. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed and crept toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The door opened with a quiet groan, and she stepped into the hallway, her eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps had stopped. The house was still again, unnervingly quiet. Ava swallowed, her throat tight with fear. Just as she was about to retreat, she heard it. Soft and unmistakable. A sob. A woman's voice, faint but clear, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. Her mother's voice. It was the same sound she had heard as a child, the night her mother had vanished. The sound that had haunted her dreams ever since. Ava stood frozen in place, the weight of that familiar sorrow pressing down on her. She wasn't imagining it. The house was alive with memories, but it was more than that. It was watching her, and it wasn't finished with her yet. The air in the mansion seemed heavier after that night. Ava could feel it pressing against her skin, sinking into her bones like a chill that wouldn't go away. The echoes of the footsteps and her mother's distant sobs lingered, replaying in her mind a disjointed melody of fear. Every creak, every shifting shadow made her skin prickle with the sense that she wasn't alone. But it wasn't just the whispers that haunted her anymore. It was the mirrors. It started subtly. In the morning, after another restless night, Ava stood in front of the mirror in the upstairs bathroom, brushing her teeth. As she leaned closer to the glass, rinsing her mouth, her reflection seemed to flicker. Just for a moment. Her hand stopped mid-motion, and she blinked, staring at her own face in the mirror. The house groaned, as if shifting on its ancient foundations, and the light overhead flickered. Ava's breath hitched, and for a split second, she thought she saw something else in the reflection behind her. A tall, dark figure standing just beyond the door, watching. She whipped around, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. "Calm down," she muttered, exhaling slowly. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her fingers trembled as she wiped away the condensation forming on the edges of the mirror. For the first time in years, Ava wondered if she should leave Harrowridge. Yet as soon as that thought surfaced, something deeper tugged at her, an invisible thread pulling her back toward the house. She wasn't done here. Not yet. The reflection was just a trick of the light. It had to be. The next day, the figure returned. Ava was sitting in the small study, going through more of her mother's belongings, when the sense of being watched returned. It was that prickling sensation, like someone's gaze boring into the back of her neck. She tried to focus on the old letters spread across the desk, but her eyes kept drifting to the large, ornate mirror hanging on the opposite wall. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. At first, there was nothing. Her own reflection stared back at her, pale and tired, hair falling messily over her face. But as she turned back to the desk, something caught her eye. A movement in the reflection that didn't belong to her. A shadow, tall and thin, passed across the mirror behind her. Ava's breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, her pulse racing, but the room was empty. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror, dread sinking in like ice. This time, the shadow was clearer, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, just out of reach of the light. His form was undefined, cloaked in darkness, but the eyes were there. 2 pinpricks of cold light, glowing faintly, watching her. Ava stumbled back, knocking the chair over with a loud crash. Her heart pounded in her chest, her vision blurring. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, silent, menacing. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as if the house itself had wrapped tendrils around her legs, holding her in place. She blinked hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she opened her eyes again, the figure was gone, but the sense of unease remained. That night, the figure returned in her dreams. Ava found herself standing in front of the same mirror in her bedroom, her reflection staring back at her, distorted. The edges of the glass rippled like water, and behind her reflection the dark figure loomed again. His face was obscured, but the glowing eyes burned into her, unblinking. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her reflection smiled, a cold, twisted smile that didn't belong to her. The figure stepped closer in the mirror, but when she spun around in the dream, the room was empty. Her own reflection, however, was no longer hers. It had become the figure. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. The room was bathed in darkness, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Her eyes darted to the mirror on the wall, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching her again. It was empty, but as she closed her eyes, she could feel his presence lingering in the room, waiting, watching. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. No matter where she went in the house, the figure followed her, in reflections, in shadows, always just at the edge of her vision. In the bathroom, in the study, even in the gleam of a polished surface. The man in the mirror. He never moved, never spoke, but his presence was suffocating, like a dark cloud looming over her. Ava tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her mind unraveling, but the dread gnawed at her. She stopped sleeping. She couldn't stand the dreams, the way her reflection twisted into something monstrous, the way the figure in the mirror always came closer, his cold eyes burning holes into her soul. Desperate, she called. "Ben, I need help," she said, her voice trembling as she clutched the phone to her ear. Ben had been her best friend growing up in Harrowridge, and though they had drifted apart after she left, he was the only person she could trust. He had always been fascinated by the paranormal ever since they were kids. His interest had grown into an obsession after her mother's disappearance, and he now worked as a paranormal investigator in the nearby city. "Ava, what's going on? Are you okay?" Ben's voice crackled through the phone. I don't know." She hesitated, glancing at the mirror across the room. "There's something in the house, Ben. I don't know how to explain it, but it's following me, watching me, watching you." Ben's voice grew more serious. "What are you talking about?" "There's a figure in the mirrors, a man. I see him everywhere." Her voice wavered, and she hated how weak she sounded. "It's like he's waiting for something." Ben was silent for a moment. "I'll come. I'll be there as soon as I can. Just stay calm, okay? We'll figure this out." Ava nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you." After she hung up, she stood in front of the mirror again, studying her own reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, eyes wide with fear. She leaned in closer, searching for something, anything that could explain the horror that had seeped into her life. The mirror was still. But then, just as she was about to turn away, the figure appeared again. His eyes glowed faintly in the background, a haunting light in the darkness. Ava froze, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man in the mirror didn't speak, didn't reach out. He just stood there, grinning. She blinked, and he was gone. Ben arrived 2 days later, his face lined with concern as he stepped into the house. Ava had barely slept, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. The air in the mansion seemed to hum with an unseen energy, something dark and oppressive that made her feel like she was being crushed under its weight. Ben didn't waste any time. He brought equipment with him. EMF detectors, thermal cameras, voice recorders, the works. He moved methodically through the house, setting up cameras in every room, but especially near the mirrors. Hours passed as they reviewed the footage. At first, nothing appeared. The house remained still, empty, a hollow shell. But when they reached the footage from the bathroom, Ava felt her blood run cold. There, in the reflection of the mirror, was the dark figure. Ben paused the video, leaning in closer, his face inches from the screen. "What the hell?" The figure didn't move. He just stood there, just as Ava had seen him, watching. But Ben didn't see him, not in real time, only through the cameras. "I don't understand," Ava whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't you see him?" Ben shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. But whatever this is, it's not friendly." That night, after Ben had gone to bed, Ava stood alone in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She couldn't help herself. She had to look. The figure was there, as always, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. This time, he wasn't just watching. He smiled. The house seemed to tighten around her, the air becoming heavier, more oppressive, as if it were sinking into itself. Every room now felt like a prison, the walls too close, the mirrors too present. Ava felt as though she was descending deeper into the mansion, not physically, but mentally. Every day spent here in Harrowridge, in this house, felt like a step further into darkness. After Ben had confirmed the figure in the footage, things had only gotten worse. The man in the mirror had become bolder. He no longer lingered just in her peripheral vision. He was always there, always watching. Sometimes she could feel his eyes on her, even when there were no mirrors in the room. When she slept, he invaded her dreams, dragging her into places so cold and suffocating that she woke gasping for air, soaked in sweat. Ava could feel herself unraveling. The line between her nightmares and reality had blurred to the point where she no longer trusted anything around her. Not the house, not the mirrors, and not herself. She stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, her reflection staring back, pale and drawn. Her eyes looked hollow, the skin beneath them dark from lack of sleep. The figure stood behind her again, closer this time. She could almost make out the features of his face now, the sharpness of his jawline, the faint outline of his smile. He whispered her name. Ava spun around, her heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The house was always empty when she turned around. She gritted her teeth, turning back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but the feeling that he had been there lingered. She needed answers. Her mother's journal, the strange symbols, the whispers, everything pointed to something deeper, something darker. Ava was no longer sure if the man in the mirror was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. But she was certain of one thing. Her mother had been involved in this. She had summoned this thing. But why? Later that day, Ben returned from town with groceries and a new camera to replace the one that had mysteriously malfunctioned the night before. He had been staying with Ava in the house since the incident with the mirror footage, refusing to leave her alone. His presence was a small comfort, but even he couldn't stop the nightmares, and she could see the fear creeping into his eyes as well. He didn't say it, but she knew. He felt the presence too. "We need to figure out what your mother was doing," Ben said as he unpacked the groceries onto the old kitchen counter. "Whatever she was involved in, it's connected to all of this." Ava nodded, her fingers brushing over the edges of her mother's journal. She had been reading it obsessively for days, trying to make sense of the cryptic entries. Most of it still didn't make sense, but the symbols, those strange arcane markings, appeared over and over, etched into the pages with increasing intensity. There were diagrams, rituals, warnings scrawled in frantic handwriting. Her mother's last few entries were barely legible, written in a panic. "The veil is thinning," one of the entries read. "I can hear them now. They want something from me. I'm afraid of what I've done." Another. "It's here, in the mirrors. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong." The words sent chills down Ava's spine. Her mother had been trying to reach something, to communicate with the other side. But whatever she had been seeking, she had found something else, something far more dangerous. "What do you think she meant by the veil?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben paused, frowning as he leaned against the counter. The veil is a term used in a lot of paranormal lore. It's basically the barrier between our world and the other side. Ghosts, spirits, demons, whatever's out there. Ava swallowed, her mind racing. "You think my mother was trying to cross over? To communicate with the dead?" Ben shrugged, though his expression was grim. "It sounds like it. But whatever she was doing, she might have opened a door she couldn't close." That night, Ava dreamt of the basement again. It was always the basement. In the dream, she stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness. Her mother's voice called to her from below, faint but clear, echoing off the cold stone walls. She could hear the scraping sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Ava." The voice called, soft and full of sorrow. "Ava, please, help me." Ava's feet moved on their own, carrying her down the steps into the blackness. The basement was impossibly dark, the air thick and cold, and the deeper she went, the heavier her body felt, as though the darkness itself was pressing down on her. At the bottom of the stairs, she could see a faint glimmer of light, moonlight reflecting off a large mirror standing against the far wall. Her mother's voice grew louder, more desperate. "Ava, don't leave me here." The mirror gleamed, its surface rippling like water. Ava could see her reflection, distorted, pale. But behind it, the figure stood, closer than ever, his hand resting on her shoulder, his grin wide and menacing. The light from his eyes burned into her, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The figure stepped out of the mirror, his cold hand wrapping around her wrist, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Ava woke with a start, her heart pounding, her skin cold and damp with sweat. The room was dark, the air thick with the weight of the nightmare. She sat up, her chest heaving, but something wasn't right. The air felt wrong. Then she heard it, the sound of glass shattering. Ava stumbled out of bed, her legs weak, her head spinning. The sound had come from the hallway. She grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the door, her pulse racing as she slowly opened it. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the upstairs window. The mirrors that lined the walls were cracked, shattered in places, pieces of glass littering the floor like jagged shards of ice. Her reflection was broken, fragmented, twisted into 1,000 distorted versions of herself. And standing at the far end of the hall, in the largest mirror, was the man in the mirror. He was clearer now, his face almost visible beneath the shadows. His grin was wider, more malevolent, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. He watched her with that same eerie stillness, as though he were waiting for something. Ava's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped closer, her hand trembling on the flashlight. She wanted to scream, to run, but something compelled her forward, something deep and primal. She had to know what he wanted. She had to end this. The figure raised his hand, pointing down the hall toward the staircase, toward the basement. "Ben," Ava whispered, shaking him awake. "Ben, something's happening. The mirrors, they're all broken." Ben blinked groggily, his eyes narrowing as he sat up. "What are you talking about?" "The figure. He's trying to lead me somewhere, to the basement." Ben's face paled and he quickly threw off the covers, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. "Let's go." The two of them made their way down the stairs, the air growing colder and heavier the closer they got to the basement door. The door itself loomed in the darkness, its surface etched with the same strange symbols that had appeared in her mother's journal. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as Ben pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning under the pressure. The basement was a cold, yawning void. The flashlight beams cut through the dark, revealing the cracked stone walls and dusty floor. But there, against the far wall, stood the mirror. Unlike the others, this one was intact, its surface gleaming like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing. Ava's breath hitched as they stepped closer. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something sour like decaying wood. The symbols from her mother's journal were drawn across the floor in dark, dried streaks. Blood. "What the hell is this?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know." Ava said, her voice barely audible. "But it has something to do with my mother." The mirror rippled, the surface quivering as if something on the other side was pushing against it. And then, from deep within the glass, came a faint voice. "Ava, don't leave me here." Her mother's voice. Ava took a step back, her mind spinning. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, his grin wide, his eyes glowing with a hunger that sent a chill through her spine. Ben turned toward Ava, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, now." But before they could move, the mirror cracked with a deafening shatter, and in the reflection, Ava saw something she would never forget. The figure's hand reaching out from the broken glass, and it grabbed Ben. The mirror had swallowed Ben in an instant. One moment he was beside her, and the next, he was gone, his scream echoing through the dark, cold basement as his body vanished into the black glass. Ava stood frozen, her hand outstretched in a futile attempt to grab him. The mirror before her rippled like water, the cracks spreading out from the point where the man in the mirror's hand had broken through. Her reflection stared back at her from the fractured surface, fragmented and distorted, like shards of her own soul reflected in 1,000 broken pieces. "Ben," she whispered, her voice strangled. "Ben, no." But the room was silent now, save for the low hum of the wind outside, seeping through the cracks in the stone walls. Ava could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the cold, damp air clinging to her skin, but she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. He was gone, and she was alone. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring into the mirror, hoping that somehow, by some miracle, Ben would come back. But the longer she stared, the more the truth sank in. The mirror had taken him, just like it had taken her mother. The man in the mirror had been waiting for this. He had been watching her all along, patiently biding his time, feeding off her fear, her memories, her desperation. And now he had Ben. Ava could feel the dark presence lingering in the room, the sense of something terrible just out of reach, watching her through the shattered reflections. But there was something else now. A faint sound, soft, muffled. She strained to hear it, and then, deep within the mirror, she heard it again. A voice. "Ava, help me." Her mother's voice. The sound made Ava's skin crawl. Her pulse quickened, her stomach twisting in knots. It was the same voice that had haunted her dreams, that had drawn her deeper into the house's madness. But this time it was different. It was clearer, more desperate. Ava stepped closer to the mirror, her breath fogging the fractured glass. Her own reflection stared back at her, pale, hollow, haunted. But behind her, faint and distant, was another reflection. Her mother's face twisted in fear, trapped in the shimmering blackness. "Ava." The voice was soft, pleading. "Don't leave me here." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, blurring her vision. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold surface of the mirror. The glass rippled beneath her touch, pulling her in, drawing her closer to the darkness that lurked within. Her mother had been trapped in the mirror all along, swallowed by the same malevolent force that had taken Ben. And now it wanted her, too. "No," Ava whispered, her voice shaking. She could feel the pull of the mirror, the way it reached for her, eager to claim her as it had claimed the others. But she couldn't let it take her. Not like this. Her mother's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Ava, please help me. Finish what I started." The words sent a chill down her spine. The journal, the symbols, the ritual. Everything her mother had been working on. She hadn't just been trying to communicate with the dead, she had been trying to break through the veil, to open a door between worlds. And in doing so, she had unleashed something far darker. Ava's fingers closed around the handle of the old iron fireplace poker she had grabbed from the wall earlier. The weight of it was solid, grounding her in the present, in the reality she still clung to. She tightened her grip, her knuckles white with tension. "I'm sorry," Ava whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't." With a scream of defiance, she swung the poker with all her strength, smashing it into the surface of the mirror. The glass exploded outward, shards flying through the air in a shower of jagged fragments. The sound echoed through the basement, a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the fragments scattering across the floor like fallen stars. Ava stood there, panting, her chest heaving as she stared at the wreckage, her hands still trembling around the poker. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The house was still, the air heavy with dust and the remnants of the broken mirror. But then, slowly, something began to shift. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the cold biting into Ava's skin. A low, guttural moan echoed from the shattered glass, a sound so deep and primal that it made her bones ache. The fragments of the mirror began to pulse with a faint, sickly light, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Ava stepped back, her breath hitching in her throat. The air around her seemed to warp, bending the edges of her vision. The shadows lengthened, twisting and writhing like living things, and then from the darkness, a figure emerged. The man in the mirror. He stepped out of the fractured remains of the glass, his form tall and gaunt, his eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. His face was a grotesque mockery of a human smile, stretched too wide, too thin, the edges of his mouth curling up in a sneer that made Ava's stomach turn. "You think you can break the curse so easily," he hissed, his voice a rasping whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You are part of it now, Ava. Just like your mother. Just like them all." Ava gripped the poker tighter, her heart racing. "I'm not afraid of you." The man in the mirror tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, but you should be. The veil has been torn and there is no escape now. You belong to me." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out toward her. Ava could feel the weight of his presence, the darkness seeping into the room, suffocating her. But she refused to back down. She had come too far, lost too much. This had to end. With a surge of strength, Ava swung the poker again, this time aiming not at the remaining shards of the mirror, but at the figure himself. The iron struck him with a sickening crack, and the man in the mirror recoiled, a twisted scream erupting from his throat. His form wavered, flickering like a dying flame. Ava didn't stop. She swung again and again, each strike more desperate, more determined. The figure howled, his form splintering like glass, pieces of him crumbling away into the shadows. And then, with one final agonizing scream, he shattered, collapsing into a swirl of black smoke that dissolved into the air. The room fell silent. Ava stood in the basement, her chest heaving, the poker slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. The darkness had lifted, the oppressive weight that had suffocated the house for so long finally gone. But she didn't feel victorious. She glanced down at the shattered mirror pieces, her reflection scattered across the floor in 1,000 tiny fragments. And in one of those fragments, just for a moment, she thought she saw him. The man in the mirror, smiling back at her, his eyes gleaming with that same malevolent light. Ava blinked, and he was gone. but the feeling lingered. The house was quiet now, empty save for the echo of her footsteps as she made her way back upstairs. The mirrors were all broken, the shadows gone, but the sense of unease remained, a gnawing doubt that twisted in her gut. She stepped into the front hallway, the cold night air seeping in through the cracked window panes. The town of Harrowridge lay silent beyond the gates, the mist swirling lazily around the trees. Ava paused in front of the small mirror by the front door, the only one that hadn't been broken. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but it was still her. For now. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the glass, and there, in the reflection just behind her, was the faint outline of a figure. A man standing still, watching her. Ava's blood ran cold. She smiled sadly to herself, tears stinging her eyes. "It's not over, is it?" she whispered. The reflection didn't answer. It didn't need to. She knew the truth. The man in the mirror was still there, and he always would be.